something I want to run past you. My speech today is about an idea I have, and it may not be received very well. You might think it's a bit crazy, but I'm going to do it anyway, so bear with me. And because it is an idea that brings together so many different threads of the discipline of water science and viticulture, I'm going to be galloping over huge swathes of details of my research just to get to the nub. So I have done the work, trust me, the research has been done, but I'm not showing my work today. Reiterating what Pancho has told us, the #1 victim of climate change is water. Either there is too much or too little, and at the wrong time. There we go. I'll get the hang of this. Water is the bloodstream of our biosphere, and without it, we can't maintain a stable ecosystem. And with the rising demand and dwindling supply, all eyes are on the agricultural sector. As according to the OECD, it is the largest and most inefficient user of fresh water. I think about 70% or more of fresh water extraction is from the agricultural sector globally. So where does viticulture fit into this? Water use is measured in terms of water footprints. We've heard a lot about carbon footprints today, but now we're going to examine the water footprint. It is a product, or it is a footprint of a product or good or service, and it's the volume of fresh water used to produce the product, summed over the various steps of the production chain. As we know, water is used in every process of wine production, and in sites where irrigation is legally practiced, this is the greatest use of the water. 83% of surface under vine is irrigated in the New World, as opposed to only 10% in the Old World. It is the variables inherent in the practice of irrigation that vary from country to country, region to region, parcel to parcel, and even plant to plant, that render determining wine's water footprint very difficult. That said, incorporating all water sources, the Water Footprint Network reports that it takes an average of 110 liters of water for a 125 milliliter glass of wine. And that's just in a temperate climate. When you start discussing our more drier, arid regions, this average is much higher and obviously is due to increase exponentially. It has to be mentioned here that there are climate change scientists and enologists who have an issue with the footprint and how it's measured. But I'm not going to touch upon that now. It's irrelevant, and you'll see why later. Here we've just quickly placed, just to give you a context, wine with a couple of the other luxury beverages or products, crops. The blue bit is the blue water consumption, and the orange is the green, sorry for the colors not matching, and the gray is the recycled water use. So it's pretty up there. Okay. Admittedly, wine's average global footprint may not be enormous compared to other crops or even other luxury crops, but it ranks as the most important fruit crop in the world in terms of production and economic importance. And crucially, its blue water, or its freshwater use in content, is disproportionately high compared to its production values. And I'd like to get a note that over 80% of the world's vineyards are irrigated, and as both the need for irrigation and current planted acreage increases, as well as additional future acreage, this footprint is wearing some very expensive La Boutin. Climate action. Now, wine is a luxury crop, although some may beg to differ, my favorite ab-fab characters. Whilst the effect of climate change on viticulture is immense, cultural traditions and consumer attachment to this luxury commodity has protected it from scrutiny and its role in the world's water wars. With the present 2-degree limit imposing new planetary boundaries and pitting science against politics, I would suggest that in the context of viticulture, the greater conflict is between science and culture. It is the failure to shift cultural perceptions of wine that risks slowing down its adaptation survival options, which are already limited by the built-in timeline of the vine. The link between social systems and food production systems in the context of wine production is a tenuous one. Wine is not often viewed as a crop. Vineyards are portrayed as glamorous holiday destinations as opposed to places of agricultural production. The consumer views wine as a benign pastime, heavy with emotional attachments to historical and cultural allegories. Who dreams of retiring and going to Colombia to start a coffee plantation, or to India to grow tea. It's just not in our mindset. Wine producers also exhibit this behavior of strong attachment. Theirs is either to historical and traditional regional practices or to profit and production-enhancing practices. Both mindsets retard the needed response to adaptation and mitigation. For true climate action in viticulture, for true sustainability, we are going to have to unwrap wine from its protective covering and look at it like any other crop. Wine has to take off its mink coat. What is sustainability? This is the most current standard definition, which I have misquoted. I missed the word meet their own needs. But it's another word that's being bandied about in the wine trade today. Organic, biodynamic, sustainable, green, natural. And there's a plethora of regional accreditations and certifications. I think they're almost all voluntary, addressing key adaptation strategies and embracing organic and biodynamic practices. And the majority of these programs focus on conservation of habitat, biodiversity, pest management, soil health, energy efficiency, green buildings, all incredibly vital and crucial elements to sustainability. But if water management is mentioned at all in any of these, it's too often concerned only with water conservation within a system of irrigation, espousing the benefits of drip irrigation, RDI, regulated deficit irrigation, or the need for better water and soil moisture measuring tools. Absent in almost every sustainability program we've researched is the acknowledgement that ceasing freshwater irrigation and choosing to dry farm would be the most effective sustainability measure of all. In the vast majority of the sustainability programs we have researched, the use of freshwater irrigation or even a water management program is glaringly omitted. It is my firm belief that going forward, true viticultural sustainability will only be achieved through the practice of dry farming. And we already know how to do this. We have the European irrigation laws as a model, as a template. It is not unknown territory. And in the New World, we have bunches of dry farmers from South Africa to Chile who are showing us that it can be done. So this is the crazy bit, I would like, although I think EU law, at the moment, the appellation law is retarding any adaptation and is kind of binding the producers from the freedom they need to adapt. And I would definitely want to see planting rights and grape variety laws loosening so they could do so. I would argue that loosening EU irrigation laws is a backward step, and we should actually instead be following their model and transposing EU irrigation laws upon the rest of the world's wine regions. Now, I ran this idea through past a few of my dry farming heroes, and they all thought it was intriguing, interesting, but undoable. One of them said to me, caution, Americans are as crazy about their water as they are about their guns. So he sent me off to Porto with, anyway. Here we go. Irrigation doesn't work anymore. Even when we consider other water resources or other water sources for irrigation, they all contribute to soil salinization, compromise the grape quality, and create artificially higher yields. And even if you do not support the arguments and the science that irrigation creates shallow root systems, rendering the plant more susceptible to drought, or that it dilutes the nutritional and microbiological components of the grape and thus the taste of the wine, or that it dilutes and erases terroir as well as damages the soil, even if you don't believe any of that, the undeniable and arguable fact that there is just not enough water to irrigate a luxury crop stands firm and is strong enough to stand alone. These are just some lovely quotes, but I think I'll skip those. I like this one. Lots of our neighbors are growing apricots and other crops. Wine is not viable. Dry farming can be a struggle, even with the right soils and winter rainfall, because of the heat. At 40 degrees and more, the stress is too much, and the vines shut down. People will adapt until they can't anymore, then they'll diversify, and then they will move. So, not very cheering. The tipping points. If we got our act together, I don't see us ever agreeing on a legislation that would implement global dry farming strategies. But I don't think that even if we did try to do that, we'd get our act together soon enough. I think that the tipping points are going to bring us there first anyway. If dry farming is not positioned, that this is the scenario I would see just with increased irrigation, forced dry farming, forced diversification, migration, and cessation. If dry farming is not positioned as the international default position, I feel that the looming collision between the economic, legislative, and ecological tipping points will make it happen for us anyway. If dry farming wine grapes is physically impossible for a producer, then diversification is the next step. Crop diversification is already in the mindset of many of the producers I've spoken to, especially those in South Africa. Many of them are already experimenting with 5 or more crops. Agave seems to crop up in many conversations, so my margaritas are safe. Now, sadly, from the most arid wine regions, tales of migration and cessation are already being heard. And for 200-year-old Tenuta in Tuscany, for example, this is an unpalatable prospect. For never in the history of viticulture has the wine industry been so intricately and intimately entwined throughout our economic and cultural identities. But dry farming could go a long way to slowing any of the need for migration. I think it would allow us to stay in where we are and get things right. At present, those resisting dry farming argue that the greatest deterrent to adopting or transitioning to dry farming is the loss of profit due to the lower yields. Yet dry farmers tell us that these can be greatly offset by the long-term savings afforded by dry farming. Dry farm vineyards incur vastly lower costs, both in terms of startup and in maintenance. Irrigated vineyards require the extra costs of the irrigation system, the trellising system, the water, as well as maintenance, not to mention license fees, water costs, and applications. Another deterrent is the fear of not achieving the required economic yields. When the Australian dry farmers I spoke to resort to irrigation, they call it rescue irrigation, at the end of a growing season, or a Bordeaux producer, many of whom I was speaking to recently, had to abandon their organic farming practices at the end of the season because of a horrible vintage, they do so, they tell me, to save their crop. But this does not mean that their vines were not producing any crop. What it means is that vines were not producing enough crop to meet their anticipated yields. So it is not an ecological construct, but an economic one. Presently, it is only those wine producers who are voluntarily engaging in sustainability practices who are taking the largest risks for the industry. If they are forced to abandon these practices at the final hurdle due to competition from their non-practicing peers, then this poses an enormous inequity and retards the advancement of the adoption of sustainable farming practices. There needs to be a level playing field. We have to create a market and a mindset that allows a yield of 1 ton per acre to be viable, economically viable. Water is also a legal issue and a rights issue. In the same instance that sustainable farming programs are voluntary, water laws are being enacted and enforced on both national and local levels across the globe. An example of this, again, is the South African Water Act of 1998, only now being enacted and quasi-enforced regarding water allocation certificates. Water is being rationed, even if a producer could afford the increasing costs. In Australia's riverine wine region, for example, severe drought conditions have forced more than 10,000 families, mostly sheep and wheat farmers, off their land. Many vineyards have been abandoned to soil salinity, unable to grow any crop at all. In the recent past, winemakers were faring better than other farmers in other sectors because their business was deemed so important, quote unquote, to the local economy that it had been guaranteed water. Chardonnay was being put before wheat and corn and livestock. This preferred treatment is no longer physically possible. From this debate over water rights, the role of the educated consumer comes into force. Increasingly, the consumer is making the link between wine and agriculture. Consumers want their eggs to be free-range, the chicken to be corn-fed, and the vegetables organic. The provenance of foodstuff is now a key market leader, and there's evidence that this demand has translated into the drinks industry. Unilever claims that over a third of consumers are now actively seeking out brands and companies based on their social, environmental, and ethical impact. And Nielsen research shows that 75% of millennials are prepared to spend more for sustainable products, up from 50% in 2014. But we need to explain to the consumer why they're paying for this risk. One of our speakers was talking about it earlier, 2 minutes, great. Who should pay for this risk? Ideally, we should create a market where there is no risk. Okay, I'm going to shoot ahead then. Okay, transitioning from wet to dry. The principle behind converting, and I'll catch up. Okay, how do we get there? Transitioning. The principle behind converting a vineyard from irrigation to dry farming is that the irrigation water is slowly and gradually reduced on an annual basis to avoid any shock or damage to the crop. And I'm going to skip that bit. So do the French have it right? The French have had 1 or 2 recent decrees relaxing their wine laws. The most recent one in 2017, I thought was quite clever in that it's revised to ensure that irrigated parcels keep to the original dry farmed yields, and only dry farmers are allowed to exceed the traditional maximum yield limits. The French may have found a balance. In a nutshell, incentives and support for transition producers are needed from local government, from insurers, and from consumers. Actions such as imposed regional yields that provide economic level playing fields, transitioning programs with access to soil experts, transitioning grants, comprehensive and legally binding sustainability certifications, regional diversification options, and modifying crop insurance. Something I read very interestingly the other day, one of the California insurance companies in their policy was saying, how do they frame it? Is fascinating. They consider drought insurance, risk-managed drought insurance, a sustainability tool, for their farmers to rely upon if things get really bad. I don't think an insurance policy should ever be considered a sustainability tool. Going faster, okay. Once I've done that one, once we're there. I think that the wine industry is perfectly poised to be the organoleptic oracle. What other industry has hundreds of years of data? We are a well-known and safe industry, highly visible, the consumer market. We must be seen to be taking action, and brand protection is important. There's no reason why we can't show the rest of the world how it's done. Yeah? To conclude, for viticulture to survive, for it to go beyond adaptation, beyond sustainability, and to become truly resilient, it must not only take responsibility for its role in water conservation, but it must also protect its soil, its low and healthy yields, and its quality, or its luxury status will be lost. This can't be achieved through irrigation. Assisting winemakers to envision an outcome of diversification or migration and the ensuing ramifications is part of being resilient to climate change. The winemakers who do not embrace such realities, however unthinkable, risk being the ones who will be destroyed by adversity as opposed to merely being changed by it. But they can't be expected to do this alone. When a natural environment is contrived and manipulated to such an extent in order to accommodate a crop's growing process, when local government legislation prioritizes wine exports over local food sources, and when the very essence of a crop's value and identity is altered beyond recognition, then assisted diversification and or migration at a forced pace may be the only answer. But we need to build a safe environment in which, for the producer in which they have to do this, transitioning. We need to stop manipulating nature so it fits into our market economies, and our markets should bend to the laws of nature. It's got to be the other way around. In the reality of the current water crisis, it is too late to debate the virtues of regulated deficit irrigation versus subsurface strip irrigation. It is too late to discuss recycled water, rainwater harvesting, what does or does not constitute supplemental rainfall, the accuracy of water footprints, or the effects of irrigation on wine quality, or the various rates of evapotranspiration. It's just too late. It's simply time now to ask, wine or water? Thank you very much.